In the frozen wastelands of Siberia, where winter temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero, stood structures that would become synonymous with human suffering. These were not ordinary prisons. They were the Soviet Union's forced labor camps, known by a single chilling word, gulag. The very name strikes fear into the hearts of those who understand its meaning. Gulag, an acronym for Main Administration of Camps in Russian, but to the millions who entered its gates, it meant something far more sinister. It meant a place where hope went to die. The year was 1918. The Russian Revolution had torn the old empire apart, and Vladimir Lenin stood at the helm of a new world. Yet this new world required enemies, enemies of the state, enemies of the people, enemies of progress itself. And enemies, Lenin declared, must be eliminated. But elimination took many forms. Death was quick, perhaps too merciful for those who dared oppose the revolutionary dream. No, something far more terrible was needed. Something that would break not just the body, but the very soul of dissent. The first camps appeared on the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea. These remote, frozen outposts had once housed Orthodox monks in peaceful prayer. Now, they would house something far different, the birth of systematic human destruction disguised as rehabilitation. What made these early camps particularly sinister was their secrecy. Families received no word of their loved one's fate. People simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The state perfected the art of making human beings disappear without a trace. By 1930, under Joseph Stalin's iron grip, the Gulag system had grown into a vast network spanning the Soviet Union. From the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Kazakhstan, from the forests of Karelia to the mountains of Kolyma, nowhere was beyond the reach of these camps. The most notorious of all was Kolyma, known among prisoners as the land of white death. Here, in temperatures that could freeze spit before it hit the ground, prisoners worked 18-hour shifts mining gold. The mortality rate was so high that guards would joke about the one-way tickets to Kolyma. But what truly set the gulags apart from other prison systems was their twisted logic. These camps were not merely punishment. They were presented as correction, as a chance for enemies of the people to redeem themselves through labor. The cruel irony was that this redemption almost always came through death. The camps operated on a principle called tufta, a system of lies built upon lies. Prisoners were given impossible work quotas. When they inevitably failed to meet these targets, their food rations were cut. Weakened by starvation, they worked even less efficiently, leading to further cuts in food. It was a death spiral disguised as justice. Within the barbed wire fences of these camps existed a world unlike anything the outside could imagine. Prisoners were divided into categories: political prisoners, common criminals, and the most feared group of all, the socially dangerous elements. This last category could include anyone: a peasant who owned too much land, a worker who arrived late to his job, or a citizen who told the wrong joke about Stalin. The guards themselves were often former prisoners who had earned their positions through betrayal and brutality. These men understood the system's cruelty because they had lived it. They knew exactly how to break a human being because they themselves had been broken and remade in the image of their oppressors. Perhaps most disturbing was the camp's economy of violence. Prisoners were encouraged to inform on each other. A whispered complaint about conditions could earn an informant an extra piece of bread. A report of counter-revolutionary activity might mean the difference between life and death. The camps turned human beings against each other, destroying not just individuals but the very bonds that hold society together. Soviet scientists working within the camp system conducted experiments that revealed the precise mechanisms of human breakdown. They documented how long a person could survive on different caloric intakes while performing hard labor. They studied the psychological effects of isolation, overcrowding, and systematic humiliation. This research was not conducted out of sadistic curiosity, but with cold, scientific precision. The Soviet state wanted to know exactly how much suffering the human body and mind could endure while still remaining productive. They sought to find the perfect balance between torture and utility. One particularly chilling discovery was the concept of psychological hunger. Prisoners who had been starved to the point of desperation would begin to see food in everything around them. They would dream of banquets while awake, have hallucinations of plenty while surrounded by deprivation. The mind, in its attempt to cope with starvation, would create elaborate fantasies that made reality even more unbearable. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of the Gulag system was its treatment of children. Thousands of young people found themselves imprisoned alongside adults for crimes as minor as stealing bread or being related to enemies of the state. These children, some as young as 12 years old, faced the same brutal conditions as hardened criminals and political prisoners. The camps had a particularly cruel policy regarding mothers and their infants. Women who gave birth in the camps were allowed to keep their babies for just a few months before the children were taken away to state orphanages. Many of these women would never see their children again, and the knowledge of this separation often proved more devastating than any physical torture. What emerged from studying these child prisoners was a disturbing understanding of human adaptability. Children who survived the camps often displayed a remarkable ability to navigate the system's cruelties, but at a terrible cost. They learned to suppress empathy, to trust no one, and to view violence as a normal part of life. The camps created generations of people whose childhood had been replaced with premature knowledge of humanity's darkest capabilities. The Gulag system stretched across 11 time zones, creating what historians now call an archipelago of suffering. Each region developed its own particular brand of horror, adapted to local conditions and resources. In the Arctic camps, prisoners faced the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia. Men would wake to find their feet frozen to the barracks floor. The cold was so intense that touching metal with bare skin would instantly remove layers of flesh. Yet work continued regardless of weather, and failure to meet quotas meant reduced rations and almost certain death. In the southern camps, heat and disease replaced cold as the primary killers. Dysentery, typhus, and scurvy ravaged the prisoner populations. Without proper sanitation or medical care, diseases spread like wildfire through the overcrowded barracks. Death came not with the dramatic finality of freezing, but through the slow agony of wasting diseases. The forest camps presented their own unique horrors. Prisoners felled enormous trees with inadequate tools while bears and wolves prowled the perimeter. Many prisoners actually preferred the threat of wild animals to their human guards, reasoning that at least animals killed for food rather than ideology. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Gulag system was its economic importance to the Soviet Union. These camps were not merely instruments of punishment. They were vital contributors to the nation's industrial development. Prisoners built canals, mined gold, harvested timber, and constructed railroads that connected the vast Soviet territories. The White Sea Canal, completed in 1933, stands as perhaps the most infamous example of Gulag construction. Over 100,000 prisoners died building this waterway, which proved largely useless for navigation. The canal became a symbol of the system's fundamental contradiction, the pursuit of progress through the systematic destruction of human life. What made this economic exploitation particularly cruel was its voluntary nature. The Soviet government could have achieved the same industrial goals through paid labor and modern machinery. Instead, they chose the Gulag system because it served dual purposes: punishment of enemies and economic development. Human suffering was not an unfortunate byproduct of development, but a deliberate policy choice. Within this nightmare landscape, human beings demonstrated both the depths of their capacity for evil and the heights of their ability to endure. Prisoners developed elaborate survival strategies that revealed the fundamental adaptability of the human spirit. Some prisoners found salvation in intellectual pursuits, memorizing poetry or conducting complex mathematical calculations in their heads. Others discovered that small acts of kindness, sharing a crust of bread or caring for a sick fellow prisoner, could provide the psychological strength necessary to continue living. The camps also revealed the power of hope, even in the most hopeless circumstances. Prisoners would cling to rumors of early release, changes in policy, or news from the outside world. These hopes were almost always false, but they served a vital function in maintaining the will to live one more day. Perhaps most remarkably, some prisoners found ways to maintain their humanity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. They formed secret friendships, shared stories of their previous lives, and even engaged in acts of rebellion against the camp authorities. These small gestures of defiance represented victories of the human spirit that no amount of brutality could completely crush. The Gulag system operated according to economic principles that valued human life at precisely zero. Prisoners were classified as units of labor, with their worth measured entirely by their productivity. When a prisoner could no longer work, they became what camp administrators coldly termed a mouth without hands, a consumer of resources without any offsetting production. This economic calculation led to the development of sophisticated methods for determining when a prisoner had outlived their usefulness. Medical examinations were conducted not to preserve health, but to identify those who could no longer contribute to production quotas. The sick and weak were systematically weeded out through a process that resembled natural selection but was entirely artificial and deliberate. The camps maintained detailed records of mortality rates, treating death as a production metric to be optimized. Administrators received bonuses for meeting production targets, but faced no penalties for prisoner deaths. This created powerful incentives to work prisoners to death, as a constant supply of new arrivals could replace those who perished. Within the camps, prisoners developed their own vocabulary to describe their experiences, a language born from suffering that the outside world could barely comprehend. Goners were prisoners so weakened by starvation and overwork that death was inevitable. Trustees were prisoners who had earned privileges through collaboration with authorities. The wall referred to the psychological barrier beyond which hope ceased to exist. This specialized language served multiple purposes. It allowed prisoners to communicate about their situation without alerting guards to their conversations. It also provided a way to process experiences that ordinary words could not adequately describe. The camps created new realities that required new ways of speaking and thinking. Perhaps most telling was the prisoner's term for the outside world, the big zone. Even freedom was understood only in relation to captivity, suggesting how completely the camp experience shaped prisoners' understanding of reality. For many long-term prisoners, the concept of life beyond barbed wire became almost incomprehensible. The Gulag system perfected techniques of psychological manipulation that were as devastating as physical torture. Prisoners never knew the length of their sentences, creating a state of perpetual uncertainty that made long-term planning impossible. Release dates could be extended arbitrarily for infractions as minor as speaking without permission or failing to meet work quotas. The camps also employed a system of false hope that was particularly cruel. Prisoners were periodically called before review boards that promised the possibility of early release for good behavior. These hearings almost never resulted in freedom, but they served to maintain a level of cooperation that purely punitive systems could not achieve. Camp authorities understood that complete despair would lead to work refusal and death, neither of which served their purposes. Instead, they maintained just enough hope to keep prisoners functional while ensuring that this hope was almost never fulfilled. It was a delicate balance that required constant adjustment and sophisticated understanding of human psychology. When Stalin died in 1953, the Gulag system began its slow collapse. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's crimes in 1956 led to mass releases and the closure of many camps. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Conservative estimates suggest that 18 million people passed through the Gulag system, with death tolls ranging from 1.5 to 3 million souls. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the true horror of what occurred. The Gulags represented something more terrible than mass murder. They constituted a systematic attempt to redefine human nature itself. They sought to prove that under sufficient pressure, any person could be broken, any moral principle abandoned, any human bond severed. The camps failed in this ultimate goal. Though they destroyed millions of lives and inflicted suffering beyond measure, they could not eliminate the essential human qualities of compassion, dignity, and hope. Survivors emerged from the camp scarred but not entirely broken, carrying within them testimony to both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. The Gulags stand as a permanent reminder of what becomes possible when a state decides that certain groups of people are less than human. They show us that the distance between civilization and barbarism is far shorter than we would like to believe, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice individual dignity for collective goals. In the end, the most horrific aspect of the Gulag system was not its cruelty, but its banality. It operated through bureaucratic procedures, administrative decisions, and economic calculations. Evil on this scale requires not monsters, but ordinary people willing to process human suffering as just another form of paperwork. The gulags remind us that the greatest horrors in human history are often committed by people who convinced themselves they were serving a greater good.